Hi, I'm Michael Janda. This is module number 6, the psychology of user behavior. We're going to start getting into some of the nitty-gritty of user behavior, user patterns, things that will help you as a UX designer to be able to craft user experiences that will be intuitive to your end user. In this module, we'll be looking at user patterns and habits in lesson number 1. Then we'll go to lesson number 2, where we'll talk about sequential storytelling and nonlinear narratives. And then lesson 3, we'll wrap everything up by talking about persona development and how to use personas when you're developing UX projects. Very important lesson. First, with lesson 1, we'll look at user patterns and habits. Now, the first time that somebody interacts with a website or an application, their habits come into play. They haven't been to this site in the past or this application in the past, and they don't know how to use it. So all they do is rely on the habits and patterns that they have embedded inside them from past things that they've done. We'll explain this more clearly here in the next few slides. The first one we can talk about is abandoning patterns and the risk in abandoning preset patterns that your user already is accustomed to. Let's look at a few examples. Reading in English is done from reading from the top left to the bottom right. You go across the page and back and forth, snaking down the page, but the reading direction is from the upper left corner and then ends at the bottom right corner. If you look at manga comic from Japan, this is by a manga artist named Yaro Abe. Manga comics, if you read them in the same format that you read English, it wouldn't make any sense at all. You would get to the end and the sequence of the story would be complete nonsense because it's not meant to be read in that same format. That user pattern or behavior that many people are accustomed to does not apply here. This is supposed to be read from the top right to the left and then snaking down the page and ending in the bottom right. It's a different pattern than what we're typically accustomed to when you read things in English. I use this as an example because when we're designing UX projects, we have to make sure that we have the end user in mind and that we understand their patterns and behaviors that they are accustomed to, and that we design things with that in mind. There's a great experiment that we'll review here that shows the risk of abandoning preset patterns of behavior. This experiment was from an article that was published in UX Magazine in February 2016 by Shay Ben Barak in an article called The Price of Not Using UX Patterns. In this experiment, he attempted to demonstrate the decrease in human performance when working with a non-standard pattern. And he took a standard keypad with the format that everybody's used to, and you can see that on the left part of the screen, and then used a disruptive keypad that still had logical sense, but it wasn't in the standard format that people were used to. That's the disruptive keypad on the right. You can see the standard keypad goes 1, 2, 3 across the top, then 4, 5, 6 in the middle, 7, 8, 9 on the bottom, with the asterisk 0 and the number sign or pound sign on the bottom right. And then you go to the disruptive keypad, which still has logical sense. 1, 2, 3 on the left, 4, 5, 6 in the middle, and then 7, 8, 9 on the right. And he tracked the mistakes of people trying to use this to dial a phone number and tracked the difference in performance between using a standard keypad and a disruptive keypad. The participants of this experiment were asked to dial a 10-digit phone number that they could easily recall, and then they were asked to dial that number twice. The first time using the standard keypad, and then the second time using the disruptive keypad. Now, prior to dialing the number, there was a 3, 2, 1 countdown that served two purposes. The first one was to make sure that the user was ready to dial the number, and then the second one was to make sure that the application loaded and it was functioning as soon as it was exposed to the input of the user. The performance time for dialing the 10-digit number was measured, and they also tracked the number of times that people backspaced because they made a mistake. You can see the results of this experiment on the screen. The standard keypad took 8.11 seconds on average for someone to dial the 10-digit number, whereas the disruptive keypad took 10.94 seconds. It's a 35% difference in time. It took people 35% longer to use the disruptive keypad versus the standard keypad. You can also see the number of taps on the backspace key. Now, 35% difference in time for something that is so small of a difference in the input device. It's still a logical format, but it's not the pattern that people were used to. They were used to 1, 2, 3 being across the top, and the disruptive keypad had 1, 2, 3 being across the side. 35% difference on such a simple task like this. If you translate that across a disruptive user environment in general, and you could have a dramatically different performance level based on abandoning a pattern that people are used to. Now, Shea Ben Barak closes his article with the conclusion saying that when users are accustomed to using a pattern, even a minor change in that pattern can be very expensive in performance terms. In fact, the minor change is confusing in two ways. First, since the difference is minor, it can go unnoticed. Hence, and two, since the user is already well trained with the standard pattern, their knowledge masks the new pattern and inhibit learning. I have been using a mouse since the early 90s, and I'm accustomed to what they call the unnatural scrolling direction. Now, I've had a lot of employees who are younger, and they have been raised on the mouse where you can have it what they call a natural scrolling direction. And whenever I sit down at their computer to work on their machine for something, to make an edit or a change or whatever it may be, I'm always confused because my behavioral pattern is to scroll with my finger down to make my scroll go down, but the natural scroll direction, people move their finger up to make the page go down. It feels counterintuitive to me, but it feels intuitive to other people. So I understand this user pattern behavioral thing, that the risk of abandoning a pattern and how it can affect my performance. I've seen that firsthand. My productivity is destroyed whenever I get onto a machine that is using a mouse with the natural scroll direction as part of the way that their settings are formatted. The same thing, we have to be careful when we create things like side-scrolling websites. And this is a website by Jenny Zhang. This one's actually pretty successful. I've been on some that are just terrible, where you're scrolling down, but the page is scrolling left to right. And it's an unnatural, unconventional way to scroll a web page. People are used to a website scrolling up and down, and that vertical scroll is what is intuitive because it's been preset. It's a preset pattern of behavior that people have learned from using websites for years and years and years. Now, these types of things can be successful, a horizontal scrolling website. You just have to be careful to make sure that you're doing it in a successful way. We're going to talk about user testing in an upcoming module, and it's critical when you do something that's unconventional that you test it and make sure that you're not affecting performance at such a degree that it inhibits the success of the product. Good UX design understands the existing patterns and habits of the end user and leverages those to control the user experience through the application or website. Let's look at some other user patterns and habits. The first one is the Gutenberg diagram. We've already shown this, we just didn't define it as the Gutenberg diagram, and it looks like this. Designs that follow the Gutenberg diagram are said to be in harmony with natural reading gravity. And this pattern can be utilized in your UX projects. The primary optical area is in the top left, and the terminal area is in the bottom right. The strong fallow area is in the top right, and the weak fallow area is in the bottom left. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering what the word fallow means. Now, fallow was a farming term where a farmland was plowed and left empty. It wasn't sown with seeds, but it was a plowed field. So these are just kind of your empty areas where it's still soil that could be used, but it's not as powerful of a place as this primary optical area and the terminal area. The Gutenberg diagram says that the eye will sweep across and down the page in a series of horizontal movements. The strong and weak fallow areas receive minimal attention unless they're visually highlighted, unless you draw attention there intentionally. And that important elements should be placed along that gravity path. Like you see in a lot of websites, the logo is in the top left, important content in the middle, and then a call to action in the bottom right. We can look at an example of a website that utilizes the Gutenberg diagram. This website, goodberry.com, has the Gutenberg diagram utilized on the site. You can see in the top left, you have the Goodberry logo, and then your eye sweeps naturally down the page across the Hi, I'm Barry headline, and then through the video, and then to the call to action in the bottom right. This is an example of a designer using the Gutenberg diagram as part of the strategy for the user experience to create an intuitive interface that leverages an existing pattern of behavior to bring the user to a call to action in the bottom right. The next pattern we'll look at is the Z pattern. You'll see this pattern utilized very frequently. This pattern is pretty self-explanatory. The eye starts up at the top left, moves to the top right, then to the bottom left, and then to the bottom right. You can see that pattern here from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. This is based on the normal reading pattern for a lot of English style reading in many other countries that read from top left and over, and you snake down the page. The objective of the Z pattern to leverage this is to place the most important elements along the path. It's good for simple design with a few key elements that need to be seen. Let's look at an example. This is the Facebook sign-up page. You can see that it starts with the Facebook logo on the top left. The eye naturally moves across the blue bar over to the sign-in area, and then it descends down to the fallow area down by Find More, and then comes over again to the sign up call to action. So this is an example of utilizing the Z pattern in a user experience design. The next pattern we'll look at is the zigzag pattern. The zigzag pattern is essentially a Z pattern stacked on top of itself. It's an expanded version of the Z pattern, and the eye makes a series of zigzag motions across the page. This is another pattern that's used very, very frequently, and you can see that in this example where the eye starts in the top left and then snakes over to the right and then zigzags down to the image, and then it naturally goes over to the body copy for that first image, and then down to the next image, and then over to the quote that is next to that image. A zigzag pattern is very, very commonly used on long scrolling pages when you want to just snake your user down the page in a series of Z's. It's a natural reading format that many websites utilize, that people are accustomed to, and it should be utilized in a lot of UX situations. The next pattern that we'll look at is the golden triangle pattern, which is essentially a Z pattern that ends on point number 3. The eye starts in point number 1, moves to point number 2, and then resolves and ends at point number 3. And the golden triangle pattern suggests that the most important information should be placed inside the triangle. This is an example of the golden triangle being in use. The eye starts up in the top left with the logo, it moves over to the navigation, and then it resolves down at the free-to-use music area. And the most important information on this page is put inside that golden triangle, the royalty-free stock music search box that allows somebody to go in and start seeing what content is available on this website. The final pattern that we'll look at is the F pattern. And the F pattern is used heavily in the internet, and sometimes it's used unnecessarily. The F pattern was originally proposed by Jakob Nielsen after he had done some eye tracking studies in his company. Jakob Nielsen was one of the original big names of web usability after publishing a book about 20 years ago relating to web usability. And he's been a big name in web usability since that day, and now user experience. In this F pattern that was based on these eye tracking studies, it proposes that important information should be in the top left, and that lesser information should be placed along the left edge of the design, where bullet points can be used to create little horizontal eye movement. It's based on the idea that people don't read online, that they scan information. So this is a great pattern to use when you have content that you feel like you want somebody to scan or just easily parse through. Info in this F pattern can be used outside of the F if the F shape is used to hook the user. Here's an example of the F shape being used, and this is YouTube, website that's popular all over the world, but you can easily see the F shape being used, where your eye starts in the top left, moves across to the bigger ad in the top right, and then descends down the page in an F pattern. If you look on the left side of the screen, you can see the F in the design when you see it called out on the right side of the screen. So it's very easy to see on a website like this. You'll notice that there's a call to action. The red button near point number 6 is a call to action, and it's nearly placed perfectly in that F shape. And then we have a big fallow area below that where there isn't any important information. Now you can see that these are the comments that people posted relating to this video on YouTube, but it does show that our eye can easily scan down that information. You'll also see that there is a strip of videos on the right side of the screen, and those can be important, but they're not placed in the F. So just because you're using the F pattern doesn't mean that everything has to be placed inside the F. In fact, a lot of these standard patterns of behavior can be utilized in multiple different ways on the same website or application. You can have a golden triangle used at the top of a page. You can use a Z pattern in the next module down, and you can use an F pattern in the module below that. They can be utilized together on the same horizontal scrolling website, or from one slide to the next in an application, one instance to the next in a mobile application, for example. The objective is to make use of standard patterns of behavior and understand what our users are already accustomed to, and then leverage those to create an intuitive user experience. When we abandon standard patterns, we start to have poor performance creep into our user experience that can cause delays, it can cause frustrations by the end user, and it can cause customers to be lost because they don't like the experience that they're having with your application.